Welcome back to CS270. In the last video, we took a look at sockets and what they're about, and we also saw some of the functions associated with sockets, not actually getting to the point of setting up a socket, but looking up addresses. And I wanted to take a look at one of those programs. I'm in the Lecture 16 code directory. You can download that from Canvas. Let me make clean and make to build everything fresh. We can see it makes three programs: host info, echo client, echo server. We'll take a look at host info in this video. So host info is a program. You run it, you give it a domain name, and it will, well, let's see what it does. Host info. So we're giving it a domain name, something that we might find in DNS. So for example, I can give my host and it prints out the IP address associated with that. And if you paid close attention in the videos where we were talking about IP addresses, you might notice that this is an unroutable address, a private address. The virtual machines in the CS department aren't accessible from off campus, and that's why their address is something that is only available over the local network. So let's take a look at the host info code and see what's happening when we give it a host name like this and it gives us back a numeric IP address. So we start off as usual in C programs with various variable declarations. We'll take a look at those when we get to them. Make sure the program is called with a command line argument. So if the number of arguments counting the program itself is not 2, so we would call it as host info domain name, then we'll print an error message. So let's take a look at what happens when we do pass that argument in. So we have a struct addrinfo here, which we're using with the getaddrinfo function. So this is the man page for getaddrinfo, and we can see it takes two things related to struct addrinfo. First of all, it takes the host name and the name of the service you want to look up if you do want to find a particular service. We're just going to look for the host name, so we'll pass null in for the service. Hence, which is a struct addrinfo where we filled in some of the fields to indicate what it is we're looking for. So in particular, we can say we're only looking for IP related entries in DNS, not things that aren't related to TCP/IP. And in fact, we will use that to indicate we're looking for IPv4 only. We can put other things in there as well, depending on what we're looking up. And a struct addrinfo **, a pointer to a pointer. So in our program, we'll have a variable that's a pointer to a struct addrinfo. We'll pass in the address of that variable, so a double pointer, and getaddrinfo will make that pointer point to, so make the pointer that we declared in our program, the one we're passing the address of, point to the first entry in the linked list of results. And as far as what's in this struct addrinfo, you can scroll down a little bit in the man page for getaddrinfo and see that. We can specify some flags. This is mostly for hints. The address family, IPv4 for example, the socket type, are we looking for streams, which is to say TCP connections, or are we looking for datagram sockets, UDP? Specific protocols, we're looking for the struct sock adder. So this is something that we can create, something that we saw in the last video. A pointer to a struct sock adder. This will be what holds the address of the result, and struct sock adder is what we need to pass into some of the later functions in the process of creating a connection. The canonical name of the host as a character pointer. This is a pointer to a null terminated character array, and a pointer to the next struct adder info because it is a linked list. So coming back into the program, we can see that we fill in the hints with all zeros, meaning all of those pointers will be null pointers. All of the integer or bit field or so on entries will be full of zeros. We set the family of the hints to AFINET, which means internet and specifically IPv4. AFINET 6 would be IPv6. The socket type to sock stream, so we're only looking for TCP. This doesn't actually matter for what we're doing. We're only looking up the host name. But if we're looking up a service as well, a port number, then this is going to be important. And then we call getaddrinfo with the host name, no service, a null pointer, the hints that we created. So hints was just a struct addrinfo. We need a pointer to the hints, hence the ampersand. And list p here is that pointer that we were talking about. That's going to point to the results, and I pass a pointer to the pointer as the last argument. Getaddrinfo returns a number. If that number is not 0, there was an error. If it's 0, everything worked fine. And stir error doesn't handle networking errors, or doesn't handle the errors from getaddrinfo, but there is a similar function called GAI stir error, and you can look up the man page for that. Rather than converting errno, it converts the return value of, or the non-zero return value of a function in the getaddrinfo library. Okay, so we've gotten the addrinfo. List p points to a struct addrinfo that has the results, and possibly a pointer to further results. So we're going to call getnameinfo to take that struct sockadder and convert it into something that we can print. So the struct sockadder is a struct that has a few different fields in it, but if we wanted to print the values of those, it'd be kind of tricky, in part because we would have to cast it to a struct sockadder in, because we know we're getting the IP version of that. But also converting the 32-bit unsigned integer for the IP address to the dotted quad format, 172.31. so on. It's not that tricky, but it would be extra work. So we're going to use this function getnameinfo. It does the reverse conversion, but of course the reverse conversion of getaddrinfo would just give us what we started with. But one of the flags we can set is numeric host, which means I want to get the host name not as the canonical DNS name for that host, but as a dotted quad IP address. It's still going to be a string, but it'll be a string representing that IP address. Then I loop over all the results I got from getaddrinfo. So P is going to be an addrinfo pointer. Start out pointing to list P. As long as it's not null, null is false, everything else is true. And to go to the next element, I follow the AI next pointer. So I take the address, so that's the struct sockaddrinfo, the length of that, because it might actually be longer than that depending on which address family we're looking at, particularly for IPv6. A buffer, which was defined a little bit further up as just a character array of max line, which in the CSAPP header is defined as 8,192 bytes. So we can get an IP address of up to that length, which is fine because the IP address won't be that long. And we also have to pass in the length of the buffer to get name info. See about that next argument that we're passing in null. That would be the service. So if we were looking up a service, a port number as well, then we would need to do pass in a non-null pointer and the length. Also, there is another flag, ni numeric serve, just like numeric host let us look up the host name, numeric or look up the host name as an IP address. Numeric serve would let us get the port number back, not as the name of that service, www or FTP, but as a string representation of the port number, which if we started with the numeric port number isn't necessarily that useful, but we still could do something with that. But again, we're not passing in the service. So we're passing 0 for the length of that buffer. We don't want to store anything there. And we pass in the flags, which were that we want a numeric host. And then we print the buffer for each time we do that. So we saw one of those when we ran it here, but if I ran it on twitter.com, I would get multiple. Okay, back in the program, let's take a look at what we need to do to get it to give us back a service as well. So we're going to pass in a string service. So I'll modify the program to require 2 command line arguments after the program itself. The hints, so that's what I'm passing in as my query or the things I want to restrict it to. I don't think I will actually need to change. Now in getaddrinfo, the service is the second argument, so instead of null, I'll pass argv2. Still passing in the hints, the list, and still checking for errors. And now when I'm getting the results back, I'll ask for ni numeric host or ni numeric serve. I'm going to need another buffer. I'll call this service buff. I need to pass in that buffer and its length. And let me print the service. And now, if I try to look up something like twitter.com http, it will spit back the IP addresses, but also the port number for HTTP, or my virtual machine and SSH port. Get that and port 22. Okay, so that's all for this time. In the next video, we'll take a look at the next step. After we've got that struct sockadder, how do we actually make a socket? So see you soon.